Hello and welcome to episode 192 of the Chills at Will podcast. It's a pleasure today to be joined by Donovan X. Ramsey. Donovan X. Ramsey is a former staff writer who covered Black life in Los Angeles for the Los Angeles Times. Before joining the Times, he was a contributing writer for such publications as GQ, Vice, Wall Street Journal Magazine, and The Atlantic, where he wrote memorable profiles of such figures as Bubba Wallace, Killer Mike, and Ibram X. Kendi. Ramsey also served as commentary editor of the Marshall Project and deputy editor of Complex.com. An Ohio native, he is a graduate of Morehouse College and Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Good afternoon. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you, Peter?
Good. And I'm sorry, I should say good morning, probably, right?
Yeah, it's a little early, but
Okay.
I can't complain.
Tell me a little bit about the Marshall Project. Is that associated with Brian Stevenson?
No, it's not. The Marshall Project is a independent newsroom that's dedicated just to criminal justice stories. Um, and yeah, it's won some Pulitzers, and it really is, a great team of folks there doing the hard work.
Awesome. And I mean, I was talking about in the book when crack was king, it's not about you necessarily, but you talk about how you were five in 1993 or so. I'm like, man, this guy has done so much in a short time. Some really impressive magazines and publications, of course. I'd love to know how it all got started. And again, if I haven't, officially welcome, it's a pleasure. Over my shoulder here, if you're watching, is When Crack Was King, A People's History of a Misunderstood Era. And some guy named Donovan X. Ramsey wrote that. You know him? Pretty good writer,
I
huh?
know him a little bit. I'm sort of getting to know him.
Yes. Oh, wow, that's deep.
Yes.
That's kind of meta right there. That's kind of meta right there. But all jokes
Yeah.
aside, it's been you've been on all kinds of shows recently in publications and in print, online, and it really is a incredible book. And as you'll say a lot more eloquently than myself, it's not about a bygone era. It's about today. It's there's a lot of connections to today and everything like that. I'd love to know how it all started. Your relationship with words, with language. I mean, were you the kid, checking out 15 library books? Were you the one doing the summer reading challenges? How did words, language particularly work in your household and your background?
Yeah. I was definitely a reader as a kid. My mom, uh, reminds me that I didn't talk until I was about three.
Hmm.
So, which I've learned might be a sign of something else.
Hmm.
But in all that time that I wasn't talking, I was just taking in the world. And my older sister Brittany, was in school before me, and everything that she learned, she brought home. So I had
Hmm.
that added advantage of learning how to read early through my older sister. And I've always loved reading. So my grandmother um, would take us to the library, and she would get us, she like got us our library cards. And whenever we spent the weekends with her, it was, get a couple of books, get a couple of
Nice.
VHS tapes. And so I had that relationship, I think, really early on with the world of books. I was also blessed enough that my mom, despite the fact that we didn't have much, we had a bookshelf at home.
Hmm.
And there were all of the things that she read, mostly poetry, a lot of fiction by Black women authors. So I grew up on Toni Morrison and Maya Angelou and Terry McMillan and, Toni K. Bambara. I mean, all of these great, great writers. And, and that's the the kind of work that I think first inspired me. People sort of reflecting on life in this country, in this society from the bottom up.
Hmm. Yeah, I appreciate in your acknowledgments the extensive list of shout outs to like authors and poets and bell hooks with the small b, the small h, and some of those that you referenced right there. I appreciate that. So there were three letters you threw in there I didn't recognize. VHS. For those listening.
I
I got
know, I know. We absolutely. My like grandmother was a big movie buff, and she loved horror movies. We had that in common.
Oh,
May the Lord, rest her soul. That she was not like the usual kind of like cookie baking nana. She was a tough
uh,
lady, and she had a pretty extensive VHS collection and also a VHS rewinder for any
oh,
young
whoa.
people that would be listening. That it was a special device that you would put VHS tapes in, and it would do the rewinding for you.
Yeah.
So that way you wouldn't wear down the motor on your VHS player.
Always thinking ahead. Always thinking ahead. Who were you reading? What were some of, especially as you got older into high school and college, who were some of the really, chill inducing writers, the ones who really maybe even made you into a writer?
Yeah. Toni Morrison is for me the greatest to ever do it. I mean, I don't think
Hmm.
that there is she's of course very lauded and awarded, but I don't think that there's an award good enough for
Huh.
what she did with language in terms of, creating new language, thereby giving shape to ideas that it kind of like existed on the tip of our tongues.
Hmm.
And that was so meaningful to me when I read Song of Solomon. She's a writer from Ohio. I'm from Ohio. Many of her books are set in Ohio. I really felt like she wrote Song of Solomon for me.
Hmm.
This story, this sort of coming of age story about a young Black man growing up in Ohio. Um, so Toni Morrison is, I can't overstate her
Hmm.
impression on me, and that's still who I judge my writing against. So whenever I am stuck, I think, this isn't anywhere as good, as what Toni Morrison would do. And I think that having such a great writer as an idol has propelled me creatively, because that is kind of my North Star. Also, I read a lot of Phillip Roth.
Okay.
I'm a huge fan of Phillip Roth. The first book of his that I read was The Plot Against America,
Hmm.
and which is a reimagining of World War II. If Hindenburg, who was a Nazi sympathizer, would have become president.
Uh-huh.
And it's so creative, but it's also so real, and
Hmm.
it grounds these big issues in his own family dynamic, because he uses his own family as characters in the book.
Hmm.
And I think it's just tremendous. Also, love The Human Stain by Philip Roth,
Okay.
and his treatment of identity is so
Hmm.
layered and complex. So, that's the kind of stuff that I was reading in high school. And also, we were forced to read the classics. A few of them stuck. I really enjoyed Frankenstein.
Okay.
Frankenstein was tremendous for me. I really enjoyed Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora
Hmm.
Neale Hurston. I think it's something that every young person should read. Hmm. Is there any like big one? I'm also um, a really, really big fan of Colson Whitehead
Okay.
and his fiction.
He just one hit
Um,
after another, huh?
I mean, they're incredible, but they're also such entertaining reads.
Huh.
That I
Yeah.
think that you know that there's a lot of stuff, including books like mine, that can be really heavy. And I try to have fun and when crack was king, but I'm inspired by people like Colson Whitehead, who seem just to be having so much fun on
Hmm.
the page.
Hmm. What's the one about the elevator salesman?
Oh, that is The Intuitionist.
Right. I
She's
mean,
a
what
elevator
what an idea.
inspector, and and it's so, I think that like he could have been an amazing journalist, because
Hmm.
he does such intense research before writing any of his books. And what
Hmm.
you can ground kind of a thriller about an elevator inspection person who is like the most gifted elevator inspector.
Hmm.
That like that feels plausible because the world is so real.
Sure. Yeah. I wonder about ideas of representation. You talked about, I mean, Toni Morrison as a Black woman, as a woman from Ohio like yourself. Um, and just, all this different subcultures that make us up. I mean, did you feel, especially growing up, like you were reading about, the ideas of mirrors and and windows, did you feel like you had to really seek out that representation, or do you feel like it was served up to you on a silver platter, or not at all?
I was really fortunate to grow up in a community where people offered me books that they knew that I would be interested in. When you're a kid that's bookish, and people may not know this about tough neighborhoods because they watch TV and they think that there are drug pushers around every corner trying to get kids hooked on drugs by giving drugs away. But my interaction was actually that, like, some of the toughest characters in my neighborhood would see me going back and forth from school, and they would say, stick with it. You don't want to be like me. Stay in those books. So I got lots of recommendations from just my neighbors and my family. And also I, was really blessed to have some great educators. I went to a school called the Columbus Afrocentric School, which was in downtown Columbus, elementary, middle, and high school, that was focused on giving Black students an education that centered us. So I had, English teachers that offered me, so many incredible authors and books. And they were young people, I think, just like straight out of college, that were just giving us what they had learned, like a few years before. And so that, I feel really lucky about on the representation front. But I do think that everybody, every person's different and unique, and you'll never feel perfectly represented by the books on the shelf. And I think that those of us that kind of struggle with that feeling of, is there anybody out there like me? Eventually, if you love writing enough and language enough, you do turn to writing to, create the book for you.
Right. Paraphrasing Toni Morrison, right? If you don't see the book that's out there about you, write it, write it yourself, type of thing, right?
Absolutely.
Well, I appreciate that. How about in, 2023, as you're a journalist, you're a published author, who are some of those writers who are really pushing you along, challenging you, or just, like you said with Colson Whitehead, just making you sit back and go, dang.
Yeah. Colson Whitehead, for sure. I'm really excited for his latest book. His book, The Nickel Boys, is one of the few books that I read while I was writing. So I was able to take a break and be inspired by that. Also, I really love Matt Johnson's work. I think that he, again, what's funny is that I write, like, I'm a journalist and my book is narrative nonfiction about, a pretty heavy topic, but I really like to read fun fiction. Things that are, fantasy, things that, have some magic realism to it. I really like Stephen King. That the cover of When Crack Was King is actually inspired a little bit by the cover for It. So the color scheme for it in the text, because I think that story of these young people, who are ignored and not listened to, but who are being hunted down by this force that's much bigger than them, that leverages their fears and anxieties, that felt to me like a bit like what it was to grow up during the crack era. And so, when it came down to designing the cover, that was one of the reference points that I shared.
Wow. Very interesting.
Was It.
Wow. I'm talking about Matt Johnson, your fellow Fresh Air guest. I have not read his work. He's hilarious, though, on his interview. I was like, man, this guy is just like a real dry sense of humor, just hilarious. I don't know.
No, he's so funny, and the work is so funny.
I bet.
And imaginative.
Yeah. So I appreciate all that. So When Crack Was King is, I think you even put out the word count and 110,000 words, something like that. But it's long. It's 360 some pages plus all, bibliography, works cited. I wonder, just about being a journalist, and you talked about some of the really interesting, or in the bio, talked about some really interesting people you've dealt with, you've interviewed, you've written about. The idea of long form versus longer form. I mean, you write fairly long form pieces, right, for Vice, GQ, etc., LA Times. But what was it like to, to write a long form? I'm a huge fan. We get subtleties, we get nuances. It's not just sound bites, if you will, or whatever the print version of sound bites is. I wonder about really just putting yourself 5 years you talked about or so, on and off, and I'm sure there was stuff even before that went into when crack was king. I wonder just about what it was like to really take a deep dive into such an important topic.
Peter, it is the hardest thing that I've ever done. And, I am naturally a pretty verbose person. And I think that my writing, sort of tends to go long as well. And, when I set out to write the book, I thought that it would just be like writing, a handful of articles. That was how I kind of wrapped my mind around it. And what people don't tell you is that when you write something book length, especially if you already have a practice as a journalist or maybe writing short stories,
Mm-hmm.
that you can only do the thing that you have practiced at, but for so long.
Mm.
So, I got about 10,000 words in, and I had used up all of my tricks as a
Right.
writer. And then I got about, say 30,000 words in, and I completely fell out of love with my own voice.
No.
It was that I didn't like anything that I was writing, that every word that I put together felt tired and, redundant. So I had to, which is a good thing, I had to create again. I had to figure things out. So if it was something like how to introduce a character, how to describe someone physically,
Mm-hmm.
that you get to a point where you've done it all the ways that you know how, and then
Mm.
you got to figure out new ways.
Mm.
And I think that it is that's the sort of make or break point, and it's probably why it took me so long. Was I had to take pauses in between to read,
Mm.
to listen to music, to sort of think creatively about other ways that I could tell the story.
Mm-hmm. That's so cool about the kind of like the catalyst, the inspiration for like that second part. Once you get past the 10,000, the 100, like you talked about. Are you a Beethoven listener? Are you a Metallica listener? Are you a Beyonce listener? Are you a Enya and soundscapes? What is there a particular type of music that really foments the creativity, or just depend on the day?
It's definitely jazz.
Oh, okay.
It's because I need uh I can't listen to music with lyrics,
Yeah,
um because it completely throws off my ability to think. I'm so language focused as a person that it's hard for me to hear a language and not be tuned into it.
that makes sense. Yeah.
So I like to listen to um John Coltrane,
Okay.
as incredible. There's a great group out of Atlanta called Jazz Specs, that is really, really fun and has great energy,
Hmm.
to their work. I'm not sure if they're still recording, but they, released, I think, about two, two, 2 to 3 albums.
Hmm.
Miles Davis,
Okay.
things that really kind of keep your energy up
Yeah.
without being distracting.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. The the book again is called When Crack Was King: A People's History of a Misunderstood Era. And you were, I don't know if it's the very beginning, I think it is like an introduction. You're writing about how a lot of the work you've done over the years, about Black Americans, about society, about everything that you've written about. I know you have a diverse series of things you've written about, but it all seemed to lead back to some crack era law, right? Or there
Yeah.
was there was something that connected you to, in the crack era, which we can't put an exact year on it or whatever, but I wonder if that was one of the seeds for the book. I wonder just about seeds for the book, some of the catalysts for writing this.
Yeah. Um, I would say that the first seed for the book was Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other
Oh,
Suns,
okay.
which I read, I think it was right out of journalism school. And for those that haven't read it, it's a book about the Great Migration of Black folks from southern states to northern cities. And it was a story that was familiar to me because I'm from Ohio. My family's originally from the South. And I like knew it intuitively, right, that I was a part of some type of like larger movement, but no one had ever kind of put words to it. This idea that that those of us that live in these northern cities, have like migrant stories, in that we were Southern, and that we entered a new place with new customs and new language and kind of started our lives over in search of something better than what we had at home. And her book focuses on 3 characters that left different cities for new cities. And I read that and I was so inspired at the way that she had taken something that people just hadn't given much thought, and she put context to it and made meaning out of it. So I thought afterwards, well, this is why you write a book. Like if you're going to write something book length, that like it should do this kind of work. Then, years went by of me covering Black America with a focus on the criminal justice system. And people that I interviewed were constantly, talking about our system, and they would just kind of pepper in the words crack epidemic. We police this way because during the crack epidemic, blah, blah, blah. And I realized in those interviews that lots of people were mentioning the crack epidemic, but they weren't talking about it in the same ways, that they, all seem to have a different take. So for me, being somebody that was born in 1987, crack predates me. I had also my own ideas, but it seemed important to do the research. So I tried looking for a book, and there wasn't anything authoritative that existed. So I thought, as you mentioned Toni Morrison, there's a book that you want to read, then like you should write it. So it seemed like a perfect opportunity to take, the inspiration that I got from Isabel Wilkerson, this topic that I knew was big and vast, and touch lots of different people, and to try to give it, a proper treatment.
The book does start off with you talking about a woman from the neighborhood, Michelle, and she definitely comes up towards the end as well, kind of wondering, how she's doing, what she's up to all these years later. But you write very well about how, crackhead was, and I guess, is definitely, still an insult, right? It's one of the worst things you can call somebody, but it's also offhanded, like, crackhead. You talk about, like Chris Rock's character from New Jack City, and just the disdain that people used the word for. And of course that's connected to, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but you make such a great connection to, like, Joe Biden and the Clintons in the early 90s and super predators and basically all the myths that surround the crack epidemic. You obviously traffic in words. I wonder if you can kind of talk a little bit about how the connotations that come with crackhead have really, how even last to this day, like the negative, a lot of them are just not even true, but a lot of the things that are associated with crackhead and just crack in general.
Yeah, I think that, for anybody that was alive during the period, you will remember that there was a tremendous amount of media around the crack epidemic and around people who used and sold crack, but that media was really inconsistent. It was largely propaganda, to be honest, right? That, like, drug users were seen as almost like zombies. And I'm sorry, I should say crack users in particular were seen basically as zombies. And drug dealers were seen as these super predators, a term that Hillary Clinton used in the early 90s. And what it did was it made crack addicts, crack dealers seem otherworldly, and it made caricatures out of real people, to the point that it's a term that people could sort of throw around loosely as a way of insulting someone. And it's my belief that was done to try to save people's lives, that sort of level of propaganda and hype. But ultimately, the cost of it was that we created such distance between, addicts and non-addicts, between dealers and non-dealers, that those people became the people over there. And we're still paying for that as a society, that because drug epidemics come and go, and we haven't gotten better at handling them, or we don't have enough empathy for the people that get caught up in them. So I think that but I should also say the fact that that happened to a drug that disproportionately hit Black America is no surprise, because if it's one thing that this country's good at, it's flattening out Black people, flattening out things that happen to Black people into these easily dismissible symbols.
Yeah.
And I think that yes, it's a shame.
I appreciate that. It was just a kind of a footnote. You were writing about one of the laws in the 90s, and about maybe like a what do you call it, in addition to the law or whatever. And you used the term, this was like in 96, 97, you used the term undocumented, which at the time was not even a term that was used often, right? It was usually the illegal immigrants. So I was just really impressed at kind of like the good historical revisionism there, like in using a term like that. And I think it just kind of permeates throughout the book, where, you, in looking back at the quote unquote crack era, you don't dehumanize the people. That's kind of an obvious statement I think I'm making, but it's what makes the book so good, is that there is not the dehumanization. Michelle is a person. She's not just a zombie down the street. The structure of the book is that you have it in like mainly 8 parts. You have the origins, you have incubation, you have the outbreak, you have expansion, surge, peak, the decline, and then the recovery. And you mainly deal with, I guess, 5 or 6. You deal with Sean McCrary. Am I saying that right? McCrae, excuse me, from Newark, New Jersey. Lenny's is from LA, from South Central, or what's now called South LA. Kurt, I love his last name. Is it Schmoke?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay, gotta do the part, right? And who's the former mayor of Baltimore. Elgin,
Yeah.
Elgin from Yonkers, New York. And Sean, I already said Sean. So yeah, but I mean, you obviously definitely humanize the epidemic, or whatever you want to call it there. And then, of course, a book like this has to have background introduction. It can't just start in 1985 or whenever, supposedly the era started. You have the origins, where you introduce the characters now. I really like that plot device, if you will, right, where we get an idea of. So Lenny is now remind me of her last name, please.
Miss Woodley.
I just thought that was so cool about, the after. We get the after, and then we can learn more about how she got there, right? And then there's, we talk about incubation. One of the first chapters, if not the chapter, is called Dreams and Nightmares. Late 20th century, you set the tone with like the Black Panthers, which, rose definitely after like Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. The Kerner Commission, that really pointed a finger and said, hey, the American government, white supremacy is the problem here. But that all really got swallowed up. And, and into the Nixon times and stuff like that. With the militarization and the Southern strategy. I wonder if you could maybe talk specifically about like the Southern strategy, what that was, and just about Nixon and just the rising militarization, or kind of like, war on drugs.
Yeah, that, within American politics, it has always been um, uh, advantageous to leverage race. That that is just in the foundation of our country's character and in our politics. That that people used to call it the Negro problem, kind of euphemistically. And despite the fact that the country's not what it used to be, that has always been a vein that has run through it. So the Southern strategy was a sort of Republican political strategy to separate poor white voters from um, from people along class lines that they otherwise have a lot in common with, by basically appealing to their racial fears and tensions. And you see that definitely come up around crack, because the crack era is really an era of retrenchment from the winds of the civil rights movement, and from the energy of the Black Power movement. So you have in the 60s and 70s what feels like all of these incredible advances for people of color, and also a lot of activity, right, like politically, and angst being expressed by people of color and all types of other folks too, right? Folks on the anti-war left, women, I mean, any marginalized person, right, sort of had a moment during that period. And there were people in the country, the so-called silent majority, who, you know, felt like enough, you know, enough of this, which, you know, sounds very familiar in the time that we're living in now, that, you know, there were people who felt like we need to take the country back. And one of the ways that they did that was this war on drugs that, you know, under Nixon really started to criminalize people on the left. It was, you know, associating hippies and Black people with drugs, which is really critical to sort of point out, right? Because almost every group, you know, has levels of drug use and drug abuse. So if you do need a mechanism to interfere in people's lives, to step into people's lives, to criminalize people, drugs are a perfect tool, because drugs exist within every community. So, you know, if I wanted to start a war against, you know, white women, that I could, like, ideally find a substance that white women use, and then target them for the use of that substance. And, you know, that's what it seems, you know, according to the record, and at least comments made by people in the Nixon administration, later on in the Reagan administration, into the Clinton administration. And Joe Biden being a part of all of this, is somebody who was a U.S. senator, you know, throughout the entire time, and was a big drug warrior, that you know, people scored political points. And that's not to say that there weren't real issues, right? You had record crime, you had record violence in American cities, but the evidence suggested that wasn't just about drugs, that had to do with larger economic conditions and the availability of guns. And, you know, it was